Hildebrand, and we're in my studio here at 8 Regina Street in Uptown Waterloo. I share this space with my husband, Chris Winterson. He's a tattoo artist. So we have a fairly unconventional pairing of mediums and processes. I'm a ceramic artist, primarily. I also work in jewelry, and sometimes in the two-dimensional I draw and very occasionally paint. So we'll have a look around the studio and we'll discuss some of the philosophy of craft and the process of making.
So Andrea, I thought it'd be interesting to start a conversation by talking about how you actually came to ceramics. I know you were drawn to a number of studios when you kind of entered the field, and so what attracted you more to ceramics than?
Right. I originally thought I was going to pursue glass, but my acceptance process didn't lead me that way through university. So I was accepted into the material art and design program at OCAD, and so I got to experiment with clay, textiles, and silver, and I enjoyed all of them, and it was a really hard choice making one of them a major, but ultimately it was clay because it sort of encompassed a lot of processes and design elements that I enjoyed in the other mediums as well. So like surface decoration that you get with textiles, and I mean, you can even work precisely with clay like you do with silver. And it allowed me to involve other mediums like wood, and what was unique about it though was a particular physical quality to it. It's something about how your body relates to the material, how it manipulates it and how it responds to it. And I think people know when they handle the medium whether it's natural for them or not. It takes a lot of physical strength to throw on the wheel, even just to lift your box of clay, and that can be a huge deterrent for people, but that sort of was exciting for me, and I enjoyed that right away. So that was definitely part of it, the physical relationship and aspect of the material, but also the culture of the material. Like, I found at school that the various studios had different atmospheres and attracted a different sort of personality, and I just really fit into the ceramic studio, and I felt like there was a kind of like fire of spirit, so to speak, that ceramic artists embodied, and that was really present in the studio at school, and it just felt like a really good fit for me.
Okay, so something that's really interesting to me as a person who's not a potter, who hasn't sat at a wheel and thrown, I find it quite mesmerizing watching people form on the wheel, and I wonder if you can talk a bit about that, what I think of as that material conversation that you're having when you're throwing.
Right. Yeah, it has a lot of ways of speaking and letting you know what's going on with it. And I think that's part of the frustration that beginners have, is that they haven't learned that language yet of how the clay speaks with you. So there's a lot of failure when you're learning to work with the wheel. So definitely there's a pushing into me that it does, and then there's me pushing back on it in this kind of tension and a little bit of a struggle to get it centered. And it's sort of a negotiation. It's like, okay, the clay is telling me no, I'm gonna be lumpy, I'm not gonna work with you, and you have to like speak sensitively to it with your hands and ask it in a way to just quiet itself into the center of the wheel. And then definitely the pulling up process. There's such a high awareness that you have to have of what's going on with the clay. I feel it's almost like holding a baby, or like caring for a baby. Like, you're feeling every minute change and being ready for disaster, for it to just fall apart or have a meltdown in front of you. But it tells you, it's, you know, I'm getting to my limit. I'm almost at my limit. Okay, I'm there, and you stop, and you can't overwork it. So it definitely lets you know, and that's the learning curve, is learning how to hear what it's telling you and respond to it appropriately.
I've heard other artists talk about what a meditative process it is.
For sure, yeah.
I wonder if you could talk about a bit about that experience for you.
Yeah. So definitely once you learn the language and get past the frustration of that first part of the learning curve, that's really difficult. It does become really meditative. I mean, it's a turning object. It's a soft medium. It's quiet. And production is, because you're repeating a form again and again, is, you saw some of my pots, that's repeated forms. You can stop making design decisions that require critical thinking and just engage the part of your brain that flows. And I think for me, when I'm at the wheel, I get into a headspace that is just a beautiful place to be. I really just think about like the romance of art and of my life, and I think I come into a place of gratitude and joy that I don't experience in other aspects or practices in my life, or even other forms of meditation. But I am able to just be really aware of how fortunate I am to have a space to work in and to share it with somebody that I love, and have the freedom and the resources and a little bit of time to fulfill my life's purpose, making art. And that gratitude and joy are, I think, the sentiments and the experiences that embed themselves in the pots. And I imagine that's why some people like them and why some people choose them. So I think that's the beautiful thing about the handmade, is that it takes on the experience and intentions of the person working with it, and that comes through a meditative experience. It's very natural, it just becomes part of it.
So I thought it was so interesting, your previous statement about the spirit of fire in ceramics, and I wonder if you could talk a bit more about what you find to be the most exciting part of ceramics process.
Yeah. For me, it's the firing process. I mean, the making is so engaging and wonderful and meditative, but the really exciting part for me is when you let go of control and you put it into the fire element. That's where the alchemy happens, and it's magic. The piece changes chemically and physically, and it invites the natural elements into the work to participate in the creative process. So with atmospheric firing like gas or wood or pit firings, you're essentially letting go and saying, I'm going to let the smoke paint this, I'm going to let the wood mark this, and I don't know how it's going to turn out. This is beyond me. So I do gas-fired work, so this is an example of the kind of gas-fired work I do with stoneware. And you get maybe flashier results. You can get vibrant colors and running and iridescence and that sort of thing in the glazes. And that's fairly exciting to me, but what I find most exciting is wood firing. So these are a couple pieces of my wood-fired work. And what's really beautiful about wood firing is that it's not a thing you can do on your own unless you're, well, quite wealthy and have a wood kiln and are producing tons and tons of work. It's typically a group of people that get together to share a kiln because they're very large, and it requires an entire night of firing. So the group of people come together, they cook together, they drink wine, and we pack the kiln and fire it overnight. So you take shifts, everybody feeding the kiln nonstop until it reaches about 1200 degrees. And the heat is intense and the labor is intense. You're chopping wood, you're not sleeping. And often, usually somebody cries. And in the end, you come back a week later after the kiln cools down and your pieces are painted by the fire. So these pieces that you're looking at right here, they don't have any glaze on them. I incised the surfaces for the drawing aspect, but I'll take this out and show you the back. I had very little to do with this. I basically applied a slip and put it in the kiln, and when it came out, I thought it was a firing miracle. Like, I formed this on a piece of wood and fired it with wood, and it came out truly expressing the spirit of wood. So it's a practice of letting go because there's a high failure rate, and it's really trusting your invitation of the elements to participate in the creative process, in the making process. So pit firing and smoke firing are one of my favorite processes as well. So what this involves is you make a piece in the clay, and it doesn't require any glaze. You go somewhere that is meaningful to you, and you dig a hole, and you bury the pots with wood or whatever combustible materials you want to use. You want to burn a really hot fire, so a combination of hardwood and softwood work really well. And for me, I think why I'm drawn to pit firing is that I can do it in solitude. Unlike the wood firing, which is a beautiful experience of sharing in community and craft, it's something you can do when you need that creative space on your own. And so you bury the pieces with your combustible materials, and you light a fire, and you burn it for 4 to 6 hours, as hot as you can get it. Usually the clay will not reach its full maturity, but what you do get is not functional ware. You get these pots that are painted on all surfaces by smoke and cinder of the fire. And for me, I treat it as a ceremony, and I treat it as a sacred process. So I think about the fire as a cleanse, and often I will use herbs or other sacred materials or objects that are meaningful to me at that time and in that process, and I'll put them in the fire. Often I think about things that I'm ready to let go of in my life, and I'll write them down on paper, or old objects that maybe have sentimental value that I'm ready to let go of, and I'll put them in the fire so that they're not lost, but they transform and they change and they become part of the pot in an alchemical change. It's a kind of magical process where you're letting go and it's changing and taking on a new form and a new story.
It was a very interesting experience for me being a teacher and working through with students what I like to call their magnificent failures. The things where they tried and risked and it didn't turn out the way they wanted to, but we found a way to turn it into a learning process, help them to continue their evolution as artists. How do you work through that kind of disappointment, or when things don't turn out the way you expected? How do you manage that?
Yeah, the unfulfilled vision, right? Yeah, you have an attachment to something turning out a certain way, and what you get in the end is something different. And I think that is especially part of the ceramic process, because like we talked about before, once you put something in the fire, there's a chemical change and a physical change that you have very little control over, especially the atmospheric firings. So that's a thing that I learned really early to work with and let it teach me, because I think what stands in the way for a lot of people with their creativity is just that attachment to things turning out a particular way. And it can be so abstinent, it just stands right between you and seeing what you've really made. That doesn't mean that every work is a success and it should be shared or sold, It's just that I don't think of failure in the same terms anymore, because I've had so many works not turn out how I wanted them to, the color, the shape, or it cracked, or it split, or it fell apart, or did this, and I took it another step, and I did something new with those pieces. Or I put them away, and I was like, this isn't to sell, or this isn't to share, but it taught me something, and because of that, I became a better craftsperson. That's how you learn and how you grow. So the piece that I'm standing with here is a perfect example of it. These are my porcelain bone trees that I made in university, so they're a little over 10 years old. And I guess the first major sculptural undertaking I did in clay. And my thesis work was about trees. When I started out, the concept was trees. And I did 5 sculptural pieces, and every one of them fell apart in some way. You know, these pieces cracked. If you get a closer look at them later, Chen, you can look at some of the cracks that are there, even, you know, perforations in the clay that were not intentional. And when I saw that, when it came out of the kiln that way, I was so upset, I was devastated. I had pieces explode. I had pieces collapse in on themselves, and I had pieces fall out of installation and shatter on the floor. And the whole year was a process of devastation and then picking up the pieces and transforming them into something new. And in the end of that year, I realized that what I had learned was not about trees, but about death. It was a thesis, a body of work about death and dying and transforming and healing and creating anew. And so I always try to remember that when I get a pot out of the fire that doesn't look how I think it was supposed to look. Because the cracks and the collapsing and the exploding and all of that is what made the work authentic. It made it true to its concept. And it's what people related to in a visceral, heartfelt way when they interacted with the work. And so it wasn't for me to judge and decide, this isn't good because it didn't turn out to my vision. There was, I think in the creative process, there's a divinity. And I think that it works through us. And it's not always about our intention. It's about an idea, a meaning, a message being expressed through us, through our hands and our choices. But ultimately, there's something greater at work. And so that's a life lesson, not only working creatively or with clay, but just I try to remember that in all aspects of my life. It just seems that I've mastered that acceptance more in clay. But it is a great teacher. It's my greatest teacher.
We've heard it often said that the art-craft debate is dead, but I think as practitioners of craft, those of us who are practitioners, we experience something of a class hierarchy between art and craft. And I wonder if you could speak a bit about the importance of craft in the world, what it brings to the world, and why you particularly are committed to being a practitioner of craft.
Right. I think one of the things that sets craft apart from just a general creative practice or an art practice is the mastery piece, the mastery of the material, a development of skill. It's a deliberate, intentional way of working with the material. It's making the piece again and again and again until it has reached its full aesthetic potential. It's about beauty. It can be about function, but it's not necessarily, I don't think that craft is necessarily baskets and pots. Craft can be applied to anything that is made by a person. It can be applied to your garden or your dinner. I think craft is applied to paintings and sculpture when the artist or the craftsperson takes the time to learn the material and master it. And concept is part of that too. And so to me, this debate about craft and art being separate things, I guess I'm not that interested in separating them. I would love to see art that is beautifully crafted and craftsmanship applied to art and strong concepts and ideas that come from the art world applied to great craft. So I'm less interested in separating them and more interested in integrating them, which is part of why you've seen in my studio I do both humble functional pots and also conceptual, more sculptural, perhaps emotionally evocative pieces as well. I'll talk about one of my more recent sculptural pieces in a moment. I think that craft has a really unique and sacred purpose in the world, and it's to bring beauty. And we think of beauty as like maybe a soft thing or a gentle thing, but I think it's a profoundly powerful thing. Beauty not only just enriches our lives, but it's transformative and it's teaching and it's healing. And I think that the energetic of beauty works so deeply that it can change fear into love and hatred to compassion and grief to joy or hope. And I do believe that craft brings that. I think it expresses that. The other role that I think craft plays that's really important is that it reminds us about who we really are. Craft medium are often earth-based mediums, fiber or ceramics or metals and these kind of things. And there's a rich tradition through history and culture that when we work in those materials, we tap into that and we keep that alive. And it reminds us of the land that we live on, and it connects us very physically with it and in a creative way. So I think craft is here to serve through beauty and service, literally service. So I wanted to just talk about this piece as well, as we're talking about the division between craft and art, or from my perspective, the marriage of the two. This is a more conceptual piece that I did for a show that we hosted for Earth Day. And this is part of that teaching piece that craft and art serves in the world. Is this piece is about Standing Rock, and I wanted to just bring that to people's attention and give sort of my perspective on it a little bit. So I think one of the roles of craft and art is to talk about the political, the social, the historical, and the currently relevant. So without getting completely immersed in the concept, I really tried to hold on to my craft values. The quality of the workmanship and the craft mediums, and there's clearly a relationship to the land through the found natural objects that I've included as well.